One quick search through YouTube will show you that some of the most popular videos from various different niches seem to be centered around the feeling we get from the deep sea. Emotionally speaking, I can understand why. The deep sea is vast and mysterious and piques a level of curiosity I'm not sure if anything else can. But at the same time, it's responsible for one of the most common phobias, an intense fear of deep water. As one of the few locations on Earth still relatively unexplored, the deep sea holds this mystique about it, something that's both attractive and terrifying. But okay, what does this have to do with consciousness? Consciousness is what makes us aware. It's what I explored in my last video. Even so, to fully understand the self, I think the best practice would be to explore what the self is not. And for us, there is an element of our psyche that encapsulates this, the unconscious. No matter how extensive our awareness may be, it will always be the smaller circle that is held within the greater circle of the unconscious. And like the sea itself, the deepest layer of our psyche holds both rewards and dangers, symbols and ideas that everybody understands. And so what I'm proposing is that the deep sea resonates because it is an image of our collective unconscious, something that directly relates to being. Ecopsychology is an interesting yet unproven idea. It suggests human psychology is inherently tied to the natural world. But there is one principle inside this idea that holds some ground. Thalassophobia. This is the fear of deep water I was talking about earlier. I think it's obvious that there is some relationship between humans and the ocean. For example, there is some evidence to suggest coastal areas have the ability to improve one's mood. However, it's odd because humans are air breathers. We fundamentally rely on vision to navigate our way through the world. And so with this in mind, the fear we possess towards the ocean makes sense, but the intrigue we feel towards it doesn't. When humans are placed into environments beyond those in which they are familiar, the imagination often takes over, especially when physical evidence is missing. And I mean, even today this is pretty well documented. Some people still question whether Megalodon is alive, and deep sea monsters are extremely prominent in ancient and even modern myths. From Jormungandr to the Leviathan to the Yakumama, these are all myths from various different cultures that explore what lurks in the sea. This idea is so deeply common that anthropologists, psychiatrists, and even neuroscientists have researched why this is the case. But among all these diverse perspectives, there's one that stands above the rest, and it is the idea of archetypes. Archetypes are innate. They are an instinct. They swim around in the depths beneath our awareness, but influence us in so many different ways. Modern neuroscience has never been able to prove the idea of archetypes correct, but it has proven that the unconscious affects decision-making through input. And if you recall, awareness of our environment, taking in the information around us, is the first step to consciousness. In a book called The Dragons of Eden by Carl Sagan about how intelligence evolved, Carl hypothesized that mythology was born out of primal fears, giving the example of dragons and suggesting the idea around them was born out of the universal fear humans have towards reptiles. Which is curious. If all these different cultures never contacted one another, why are these myths about sea monsters so similar? Not just in how they look, but in what they represent. We all understand the power of instinct. We see it around us every single day. We see it in our friends and we see it in our family. We see it in our interests and in our fears. It's the pattern that drives us to express physiologically, something that extends throughout nature. Instincts are like a blunt force, and for whatever reason, we can't resist their pressure. But it's not just in our fears. Intuitively, we all understand the hero's journey, a depiction of a savior who needs to restore order to a corrupt land, a motif that is always the same, regardless of how the fantasy world around it changes. The best way I can explain it is, instincts are biologically ingrained patterns. And by the same token, there are other patterns that express themselves psychologically. This is what is referred to as archetypes. An obvious example would be the feeling of being in love. In such moments, it's almost like you're struck by something. You can't really explain it and can't put your finger on it, but this aura will control your perception of the world and make you view things in a new way. The theory of archetypes suggests we inherit modes of living, similar to the way a bee instinctively knows how to sting, or a baby bird just knows how to flap its wings. It's a pattern of behavior. Despite cultural differences and geographical distance, sea mythologies share common motifs because they tap into these universal instincts. These fears resonate on a primal level. These journeys and symbols represent common challenges, all of which are expressed through root mythology. Consciousness is a very difficult thing to try and quantify. Even so, By far the most common definition I've seen is consciousness being defined as awareness, with more awareness of the world theoretically transcribing to a higher level of consciousness. But awareness itself is also abstract. Of course, it can be taken literally in the form of using senses to navigate our environment, but emotions help us process information. Ideas help us understand them, and imagination helps us make sense of things we don't yet know. So awareness is definitely multifaceted and can be thought of as anything that helps us understand the world better in any way. With this in mind, the predominantly held belief among psychoanalysts is that these archetypes are the result of the evolution of the human psyche. But the question would be, for what? Before I proceed, I'm going to say something that's a bit out of pocket. Culture shapes consciousness. I know this sounds really strange to say, but let me explain my point. Human beings are social animals, and one of the most fundamental things we have to learn is how to successfully live among others. Human language is probably the best example of this, but there are others that we share with primates, such as courtship or aggression. Regardless, the effectiveness of social groups, in an evolutionary sense, is dependent on how quickly its members can learn these norms. Because of this, it's not a stretch to assume humans have a predisposition towards learning how to successfully live in a group. Although this would slightly vary from culture to culture, many of these customs are universal and learned implicitly by observing others, usually through subtle forms of reinforcement. In Freudian psychology, there's a concept known as the superego. It represents the internalized moral values of society that are developed during early childhood. While the superego complex is typically thought of as part of the nurture element, since it is a behavioral set of norms you learn throughout your life, there is a selection pressure in evolutionary biology that through learned norms can change gene expression. This mechanism is called the Baldwin effect. If by chance or through some other means, some individuals happen to possess a genetic bias towards learning social norms, they would be able to grasp the principles of effective group living more readily. And as a result, the groups they are a part of would be able to function better and eventually outcompete the other groups that don't have this tendency. So all things being equal, the genes that create this bias will spread more rapidly. As a consequence, over time, these norms would become less of a learned skill and more of an innate behavior, meaning aspects of our culture that have a selective advantage will gradually become genetically encoded. This is also referred to as the niche constructionist perspective, which I've made a video on, and has been observed in non-human animals as well. Regardless, this is what I think people refer to when they say the collective unconscious, which is the universal reservoir at the bottom of our psyche, where our archetypes lie. Jung thought the internalized values of society develop around archetypal patterns, but I think it's the opposite. The Baldwin effect over time fleshes out the behaviors of the superego that offer advantages to a community, and as a result, these behaviors become less of a learned complex and more of an innate instinct. A set of instincts that today psychoanalysts call the archetypes. That's my theory anyway. Still, instinct does not equal consciousness. And one reason I believe this, that I haven't seen many people argue, is that consciousness is what helps us do things we choose to do as opposed to things that happen automatically. When we're doing this, we need to pay attention and coordinate action. That's what the senses are for. But because there's so much information we are subject to from so many different angles, there has to be something that can organize this information. For us, that's what we call the ego, our identity, the central hub of our psyche that is responsible for organizing all of the sources of information so the self can take action. Simply put, our egos help us see ourselves as separate from our thoughts and actions. The problem with this, though, is we can deceive ourselves into thinking we have more control than we actually do, which brings us full circle to Jung's understanding of the psyche and its relationship to consciousness. Copernicus was the first to make the groundbreaking realization that the Earth revolves around the sun and is not the center of the universe. In the same way, Jung came to the conclusion that our ego, our sense of identity, is not the center of our psyche. Instead, the ego serves as a mediator between different influences, including the archetypal instincts, genetic traits, and newly learned behavior. In other words, full consciousness, the full human experience, can only be reached when we integrate all of these different elements into our psyche through a process called individuation. This is a significant stretch I'm about to make, and I realize that, but I think it's worthwhile. The sea, the deep sea, is the archetypal process of individuation. Just as the ocean symbolizes the depths of the unconscious mind, the process of individuation represents the journey of becoming your full conscious self. And this is one of those universal narratives that over time has gone from learned behavior to instinct. How? through stories. It's why hero stories always follow the same structure, why villains always pursue the same objectives, why myths always have the wise old mentor character, and why we intuitively understand things that on the surface shouldn't make any sense. The best example I can think of to explain this is the villain has a point motif. In the majority of the most popular movies and shows in the last couple decades, all of them have a villain that, at least in part, people thought had a point. I'm not saying that they were right, but that they weren't fully wrong. I don't know if you guys watch anime, but there's no better character that can summarize this one point for me than Pain from Naruto. I'm not going to go into the story just in case you want to watch it, but what I will say is the archetypal process of the shadow is why this resonates. In the hierarchy of virtues, the villain is often higher than the average person. Now, that does not mean being the villain is good. Absolutely not. That's not what I'm suggesting. But villains in stories often have something that the average person lacks. Courage, bravery, the ability to think for themselves and to defend themselves. The danger comes from being so wrapped up in your ideals that you are unable to realize the ideas possessing you. This is why people often say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. This is something we will all face, and it's why the shadow motif is an instinct. The way out, which is shown in the archetypal hero stories time and time again, is to incorporate your shadow side into your ego, into yourself, and never let it fully possess you. This is why heroes in traditional myths are always capable. They can fight if they have to, but only do so if necessary. Even so, this requires the aggressive or evil side of yourself to accomplish. As I've stated time and time again throughout this video, consciousness, while being multifaceted, fundamentally involves the ability for us to understand things, to be aware. Archetypes are instincts within the unconscious that accomplish just that. But these learned norms are not exactly literal applications, but more so metaphysical guidelines. The hero archetype, for example, encourages bravery, protecting others, and going off into the unknown, all of which are essential to a small tribe of early humans. The shadow instinct reflects the darker aspects of human nature, acknowledging that these traits exist within everybody and need to be understood and incorporated so within-group conflict can be minimized. Finally, the wise old mentor archetype generally reflects the value of accumulated experience, taking shape in the form of knowledge or respecting tradition or your elders and whatnot. All of these and many, many, many more often only emerge into conscious thought intuitively. It's not like we think about it, they just naturally influence our thoughts and behaviors. It could be to help us make sense of our experiences, or it could be because of my theory to aid in group functioning that I laid out earlier. Regardless, it does seem to be the case that these archetypes affect us in some way, and that's because in stories, we all intuitively understand these themes. Up until this point, I've brought up the hero myth consistently, but as my final point, I want to explain the relevance of this. It's funny that as conscious beings, we have this drive to find purpose. Part of that is our biology, and I'm going to make a video on that. But the other reason is because of the hero archetype. These narratives mirror the process of individuation. It requires a goal. It requires a sacrifice. It requires suffering, but will also bring joy. But above all else, pushing ourselves to be better, usually by going into the unknown, is the most fundamental part of this process. I had a conversation with my friend the other day. He's been looking for work and has kind of been struggling recently. We talked about the uncertainties of everything going on in the world, questions about professional identity and the challenges that come with building skills in general. But what I walked away thinking about was the optimism we both had about the glories that lie ahead. I've had conversations like this with pretty much everybody I'm close to. And what's funny is no matter who I talk to about what they want out of the future, I can always see the similarities between this pursuit of a new life and the found ideals in the mythic quest of the hero. I can see the hints of the heroic in the pursuit of purpose, with rites of passage that come in the form of figuring out what you're good at or what you like doing, or even things like how to take care of your future family. Some people would laugh at this suggestion, and fair enough, but there is something about finding a career or a purpose or navigating your way towards what you want in life that sets one upon their own hero's journey, as lighthearted or difficult as it may be. In fantasy worlds, these instincts often take shape in the form of grand adventures or escape and success. But there is another heroic quest, the one in which we find that which is most real, most truthful in our everyday life, the way in which we find ourselves. And if there's anything more that could represent consciousness, it would be that, finding ourselves, which embodying the mythic instincts of archetypes help us do. And that is my theory on how instincts shape consciousness. Until next time, cheers.